Welcome to Conversations, a podcast provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders and sponsored by Grace Theological Seminary. I'm Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. Let's jump into the conversation for today. Welcome to Conversations, a podcast provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders and sponsored by Grace Theological Seminary. I'm Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. So let's jump into the conversation for today. And I am blessed once again to have in the podcast studio here at Grace, Dr. LaJoie. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, my friend. Always good to be with you. This is fun.
You know, Doc, you're just the kind of person, no matter what day you're having, when you're in the room, life is just better.
I say praise the Lord. That's Jesus. That's not me.
Well, so good to be with you. We have a special guest. We're trying to work on our other guests getting in here, but we have a couple authors, and they authored the book, Virtual Reality Church. And so on the line right now, we have Jonathan Armstrong with us, who's one of those co-authors. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And you're joining us from Germany.
Yes, sir. I'm calling from in fact, I'm looking out my window here. I'm up looking out Michelbach, which is a small village just north of Marburg. That's dead center in the middle of Germany.
Wow.
I'm fighting envy right now.
Yeah,
Brock.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
We need to do a field trip out there.
We need to do a field trip.
Yep.
For sure.
Well, that exchange is always good. But yeah.
Well, let's share with our audience here just a little bit of the background of Jonathan Armstrong. Currently serves as the director of, can you help me with that name in Germany, sir?
Yeah, I apologize for it. There's nothing I can do about the name. It's just terrible. The name of the little foundation that I direct in Marburg is called the Bodelschwing Studienstiftung.
I am so glad I didn't try to do that, Jonathan.
It trips up even German. It's terrible. But it's a small foundation based in Marburg, and our goal is to help theology students. Of course, the university system is really liberal here in Germany. And so a bunch of pastors from Germany, indigenous pastors, got together about 40 years ago and said, hey, let's set up a support network for theology students. And that's what I do.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, let me pick up on the bio right after that beautifully spoken title in Germany. So I'm going to pick up with the word which is a foundation that supports theology students at the University of Marburg in Germany. Jonathan formerly served as professor of Bible and theology at Moody Bible Institute for 11 years. And Jonathan also serves as the president of the Aqueduct Project, a mission to foster the unity of global church through educational initiatives. So again, let me formally welcome you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a delight to be with you. Thanks for your interest in this topic.
Well, I am here with Dr. LaJoie, and Dr. LaJoie heads up our Doctorate of Ministry program, and he is just innovative. He's creative. He's welcomed the idea of hybrid church. So Doc, I'll let you just talk a little bit about our doctorate program, and then how we're kind of going towards this particular concentration.
Yes, thank you. So we have a number of concentrations in the doctorate program. We have ministry leadership. We have a new preaching emphasis as well. We have interdisciplinary, intercultural, and of course, we have hybrid church, which will be fully online. Some of these are where they take 4 core courses on campus, and then the 4 concentration courses. Actually, I should say 4 core courses online, and then concentration ones are on campus. So the virtual church will be rolling out this fall, in fact, 2024.
And I believe Darrell is on now, correct?
Correct.
Darrell, we've got everyone on the podcast now. We just start going through introductories on everybody.
Okay.
Let me introduce to our listening audience Dr. Darrell Bock. Darrell Bock is Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, and serves as Executive Director of the Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership. He is an Elder Staff Advisor at Bent Tree Fellowship in Carrollton, Texas. He also served on the board of Chosen People Ministries for over 2 decades. In addition, he serves on the board of Wheaton College, currently chairing the Academic Affairs Subcommittee, as well as the boards of the Institute of Global Engagement and Christians in Public Service. He is a fellow at the Kirby Lang Institute in Cambridge, England, and a graduate of the University of Texas with a Bachelor's of Arts, and Dallas Theological Seminary, THM, and the University of Aberdeen with a PhD. He has authored or edited over 45 books, including New York bestseller, nonfiction, numerous works on Jesus and the Gospels, and the recently released Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse Pluralistic World. With that said, Dr. Bock, welcome to our podcast today.
I'm glad to be with you.
We were just sharing that our interest here of the book, Virtual Reality Church, is it sparks our interest, certainly of various shifts and changes in culture. But here in our seminary, we try to be as innovative as we possibly can, to the extent even now we're looking at concentrations, and we are offering a concentration in hybrid church in our Doctorate of Ministry program. So we're looking forward to this discussion with both of you gentlemen today. I'm going to kind of skip. We've had a little bit of a late start, so we've talked about some of the academic backgrounds and some of the journeys you've had in ministry. So I'm going to pose this question to both of you. Let's talk about virtual reality churches, and could both of you just kind of unpack briefly that concept?
Absolutely. You go first, Darrell.
Okay, well, virtual reality church is a church that doesn't meet in a specific location. It meets virtually. It often uses media that would involve, for lack of a better description, goggles that you connect with, and it's a way of pulling people together in various locations into a single session that they can share despite their distance. So it's not quite the same thing as most people are familiar with when they do church online, but it is similar in the kind of reach that it can have. That's a pretty bare bones definition, and I'm sure Jonathan can add to it.
That gets us in the right direction. Thanks, Darrell. I find it really helpful to realize that over the last 100 years or so, the church has leaned into different electronic technologies, different mass media electronic technologies, and that act has really shaped the church. So back in the 1920s, we had this thing called the Church of the Air. And most people have forgotten about it, but that was a big deal in the early part of the 20th century. And what that was is, of course, we're still talking about real churches. We're talking about real people, right? But they leaned into the possibilities of radio ministry, and that reshaped Christianity. And we had this thing called the electric church through the 1960s when TV was really big. And then we had this thing in the 2000s called the internet church. And you can look back at the literature, people are talking about the internet church. And now we're talking about the virtual church, the virtual reality church. We're not saying that real churches go away. We're not talking about churches made up of other than real human networks, but we're talking about using those tools to do real ministry. And so a virtual reality church is a church that's going to use the possibilities of this new communication media, virtual reality, for real ministry purposes.
So we can pretty much say that we're not talking about in place of, we're talking to in addition of.
I think that's correct. I mean, with the early experimentation that came out in the mid 2010s, so the earliest apparatuses became publicly accessible around 2015, 2016. And there were some communities that assumed that a virtual church would replace an in-person church. And I think that's probably not going to catch on with many people. I think that's always going to be a tiny minority. But what we're advocating in this book is that real brick and mortar churches start using virtual reality equipment and communication possibilities for the good of their members and for the good of their communities.
And there is a lot of overlap, I think, between what virtual reality churches can do and what churches attempt to do when they're simply streaming online. And so sometimes I like to think about, well, why would one want to do this? Why would one want to have a church that's set up this way? Although I will say a virtual reality church is a little more intentional in dealing with the issues of distance and in some cases protection than say an online church, which tends to be a service that's attached to an existing local church service. So things like, when people are sick, can they attend church? Or if they're undergoing severe persecution, it's not safe to gather. Can they attend church? If I have a missionary connected to a church in a different location and I want to keep up with that community, can I attend that church? If I'm traveling, but I want to stay in touch with a church series, can I attend church? Now, all these apply to not just to virtual churches, but they would apply also to online churches. And then if I move to a new location and I'm looking for a church home, but I want to stay connected to the people who I've built community with, that's another rationale for doing it. And then the last one, which is probably important in the virtual reality church in particular, people who want to kick the tires on faith but are a little hesitant to be very public about it. I would say in those 6 cases, you have a rationale for either online or virtual church function, and particularly virtual church function works well in persecuted environments or environments where someone's living in a context and there's not much potential for church support where they are.
Do you see within those dynamics, is it simply those categories, or are you seeing more of a proclivity of age group? Is there certain age groups that are drawn to virtual reality church more than others?
What I think I'm seeing is that the folks who are actually the best and who are the best at using digital tools for group communication, and the people who are doing that in the broadest networks, specifically of religious organizations and churches, they're actually our baby boomers. Those are the folks who are 65 and older. There is a very large group of children who are using virtual reality. Roblox is a very popular platform. There's about 200 million users. Almost all of them are children, or about an average age of, say, 14 or 11. And I'm not sure if those young people are really connected into church usage yet. But the folks using, the folks doing Zoom prayer calls and the folks who are watching sermons online, that's going to be an older demographic usually.
Gentlemen, this is directed to both of you, so feel free to contribute. I'm thinking more along the lines of gains, if there's a better word, say it, or perhaps forfeitures of blessings or benefits. And I'm thinking of a few scenarios. For example, outreach. I can see the benefit of reaching those who are just not going to come in the physical church. It's just not going to happen. And so this is, to me, that's pretty much all gain from the way I look at it. And then you already alluded to regions where physical church is outlawed, and there's danger, perhaps, and they don't even have a physical building. It wouldn't be allowed. So that would make sense as well. And then I'm thinking of a third scenario where, to exaggerate the point, imagine a Christian family living in a large city here in the States with blocks. They have the street in the front of the house, an alley in the back, another behind the alley there. And here's a family who lives right in the middle of the block. To exaggerate the point, on one end of the block, there's a Bible church. The other end of the block, there's a Baptist church. Maybe they were attending that. And then along the lines, they decide by preference, they're out by choice. Why don't we just stay home and do either virtual church, VR church, etc. In that scenario, what are the gains and the losses? The first 2 scenarios seem pretty clear to me. That third one, what would be a gain or a loss there? Here's 2 churches on either side, and they say, well, we're not going to attend either one. By preference, let's do this. What sayest thou?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that there are 3 poor reasons for using digital means only as a way of gathering for church. One is simply for convenience. When I use the travel example, that's not convenience. I'm in a location detached from my church, but I want to stay connected.
Absolutely.
The second is to use distance as a shield for not getting too close to other people. part of what church is supposed to do is build community, and people get to know one another and get to encourage one another in the faith. And so when our distance is used as a shield for not getting to know other people, that's not a good reason. And then finally, and this reverses the last point, is to avoid contributing to a community. In other words, I'm not supposed to go to church as a spectator. I'm supposed to go to church as a participant. And so if I'm opting out as a way of saying, well, I want to get fed, but I don't want to give anything back necessarily, that's not a good reason to be using these means for gathering. So I would say those are three of your losses, if you will. And that don't contribute and really are not good reasons to be connected in this kind of a way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jonathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm glad that we can talk about gains and losses. That was something that Darrell really gave to the project that I really, really appreciate, and as a junior writer here, is that Darrell's been dealing with media for a long time and has enough experience to know that there's always a gain, there's always a loss. And the folks who do media ecology, we introduced the theory of media ecology in the first chapter. That's sort of one of the standing principles of the movement, is it's never a pure gain. It's always a gain and a loss. When you get something, you give something too. So, but in this case, the scenario you've mentioned there, what's the gain and what's the loss there? Well, there's a couple. Even in a context that might be saturated with good churches, still there are advantages in a virtual setting. For example, maybe that person who's going to the virtual church is part of a diasporic community, and maybe language is a barrier. So, but let's say an African person who's moved into someplace besides Africa, and in that context, it might be comforting to be able to worship with other Nigerian Christians, even if it's in an online venue. So for diasporic communities where language is a barrier. Also, if you step into online communities, they're almost never tied to an actual geographical location. So you're almost always socializing with a much broader demographic. And that in and of itself can be, I think, enriching. If sermons sometimes deal with recent news, and in an online context, when you're spiritually processing stuff, you're always processing it from many different countries at the same time. So that perspective can help you pull yourself out of a particular national bias or a particular language bias. So, and I think those can be things of real spiritual help. They can help us get a real perspective on our faith. There's also, of course, convenience, but I expand that category just a little bit. For example, my family lives in Germany, and even though there was a great church here in Marburg, and even though my family can speak German, even though it wasn't just for that reason, it was still comforting for us to tap into the preaching of our pastor back in Chicago, because we knew that family, and we knew those folks, and so it was a spiritual comfort to us that we could experience that, even though that wasn't our regular church experience.
And if you think about what these churches can offer in a unique way, thinking about gains, there's prayer networks are nicely managed in this kind of a means, and again, I'm thinking about the overlap between virtual and online. There are one of the things virtual experience can do that an online experience might not be able to do is to provide what I'm going to call a kind of community theater, which means that you can act out and animate biblical stories in a way that's very, very difficult to do in-house in a normal kind of setting. That's a gain that comes that most people don't even think about. I remember sharing when we were working on this project with Jonathan, going online with my goggles on and actually being allowed to be on stage while an opera is taking place and get close to the people who are acting. Normally, I'm hundreds of feet away in an audience, and that changed the nature of that experience. Well, you can reenact Bible stories in a vivid kind of way that can impact people in this means that is not available to you so simply in a normal, what we might consider a normal or a common church situation. There's coaching and mentorship that can take place over a distance. I've done numerous classes, where I'm in Dallas and people are in India, and it saves the schools my travel expenses, my lodging expenses, et cetera, but they can get access to content. So this is a good means sometimes to deliver the content aspects of what a church is about, even though it may come up shorter on the to a degree on the relational side, although I've built relationships with some of these people who I meet face to face for the first time way down the road. And so there are a variety of ways that being linked together that spans distance that really become possible. I mean, we are talking about capabilities now that we couldn't even have conceived of 150 years ago.
Yeah, excellent response. Go ahead, Jonathan. Did you have something else?
Thank you. If I could just make one more point too. I think a lot of folks, when they evaluate the proposition of a virtual church, online church, they're worried because they approach the question saying, hey, these churches, communities ought to be places where there's spiritual transformation taking place. That means we need a really deep relationship. That means we need to be vulnerable with one another. And we presume that means that could be best done in person. And I think for my generation, I'm 44. Yes, that's true. Being in person still allows me probably to do my best thinking and my best spiritual reflection. But I think there are actually benefits with certain demographics, particularly with our young people, where, for example, they might be vulnerable about their life in a way over text with their friends that they can't do face-to-face with their parents. So actually, it's too early in this story to figure out exactly how these things work, but I think for a coming generation, there's a need to do some pretty serious spiritual reflection on how to pastor people through online relationships, because our young people, for some conversations, including for disclosing sometimes vulnerable information, they may actually prefer digital media. So we need to learn to be able to work with our young people well.
And let me put this in a theological context, because up to this point we've been speaking mainly pragmatically, and that is, when you think about the term church, we really do use it in two ways. And on the one hand, there's the local church, and we think about a building and walls and parking and getting together and potluck suppers and prayer time and sermons and Sunday school, all those kinds of things. But there also is the meaning of church that says we're just talking about people who have a spiritual connection to Christ spread across the globe. I mean, when Paul writes to Corinth, he says, to the church in Corinth, which tells you that he's thinking about a different conception of church. And what technology does, if I can think about it theologically, is it links people in different locations to one another in a shared faith kind of way. And then when you put on top of that God is present anywhere and everywhere, I like to joke that God's been Zooming for a long time, that God is anywhere and everywhere, that kind of linkage, kind of bridging those two definitions of church becomes possible. And we ought to think about it that way theologically.
I love that. God's been Zooming for a long time.
That God has been Zooming. We may just entitle this podcast, God Has Been Zooming for a Long Time. Hey, gentlemen, there's a concept, and I'm going to be very sensitive of our time today. There's a concept that I read in your book, and whoever would like to address this, and I think you already have to an extent, but the chapter talks about incarnation and Pentecost. Could you address that?
Darrell, you're up to bat.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the idea that God is everywhere all the time, that the Spirit resides in people across neighbors, that we're thinking about how do we love our neighbors in a digital age. We're able to be more connected. When I open my talks on cultural engagement, this is where I start. I talk about the Telstar satellite, and I talk about how the communication revolution is something we're still dealing with, and I contrast what the Telstar was able to do a signal one way from North America to Europe in the summer of 1962, and then they had to turn off the switch and reboot, and then 3 hours later, they sent the signal in the other direction because it only go one way at a time. And then I pull out my phone and talk about what we're able to do now, and I make the point there are more of us, and we're more tightly connected, and we're more aware of one another than we've ever been. And that's actually one of the challenges of our modern lives is we used to be able to exist in kind of these sociological bubbles that we lived in where we were part of our own. Now we're so totally connected to one another. And the possibilities that opens up is actually what we're talking about. And so how do you do that well? How do you prepare the church for that well? How do you deal with a generation who have many, many relationships that have been, mediated through digital means as much as it has been face-to-face? How do you deal and cope with all that? And so when we were talking about, Pentecost and what that represents, Pentecost was kind of an initial shot at that in one sense because of the nature of the audience at Pentecost. Remember that chapter opens up with people from many tribes and many nations being present while the Spirit's being distributed to believers for the first time. And so, and then they scattered and took that to the various locations that they represented. Well, now you not only scatter, but you can connect. And so that's sort of what we were talking about. So there's a sense in which we're located and we're embodied beings on the one hand, but we've also been now given the capability of connecting to people who aren't physically in the location that we're in. And so how do we do that? Well, the link is not only technology. Now I'm going to have a little fun. The link is the Spirit of God that we share. And so thinking about it that way, I think can help us also think about what the possibilities are.
So, brothers, in your book, you say VR simulates sense experiences, but cannot directly present abstract concepts. Can you elaborate on that? Are you there thinking of the spoken and written word, which informs concepts and images? What did you mean by that phrase?
Great. So I'll step into that if I may. So that was a point that came out of my experience in running a virtual reality lab. I had the privilege of running a virtual reality lab at Moody Bible Institute from the spring of 2018 to the summer of 2020. And the technology seemed a lot newer at that time. That was only 7 or 8 years ago, but that seems like a long time ago or 6 years ago. That seems like a long time in the technology development. And as I experienced virtual reality and worked in that environment, I at first assumed that somehow working in virtual reality, I'd be able to communicate huge amounts of really deep information. Using virtual reality would speed up the educational process. And I think that was fundamentally wrong-headed. I realized that what the experiences are that you can have in virtual reality are incredibly concrete. You can take walks in parks, you can ride roller coasters, you can walk in old buildings or see ruins, but those are all very, very concrete experiences. And so much of what we're trying to do in educational processes is develop abstract ideas. And I'm not particularly sure that VR is ever going to speed up those processes. It does make things more memorable, certainly makes them more pleasurable and enjoyable. But for a large bulk of the work of education, you're still going to have to use language and philosophize and theologize, just as the way we've been doing for centuries.
Darrell, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the issue here is that the communication of ideas is the communication of ideas. And media may be able to help you visualize those ideas. When that can happen, then maybe there's some things you can do virtually to help visualize an idea, or, but if I'm in a room, I can do it through a slide or through technology or through video. So I'm not sure the means of delivery in a virtual reality or an online form is going to alter too much how we communicate the ideas that people have to process as concepts primarily, and thus, they're going to have to put on their thinking cap, whether they're sitting in a pew or they're connected online digitally.
Very good, thank you. So it's really, we're thinking about the various medium and delivery, and again, what are its limitations, what are its strengths, and there's a little bit of both. But as we're all thinking through these issues coming our way and more to develop in the future, it's good to get these on the table and look at them from all sides. So I appreciate both both of your responses.
Dr. LaJoya, I could spend the next 8 hours talking to our guests today. What an intriguing topic, and I think a needed topic, especially here at Grace College and Seminary as we are implementing some new innovations. As we conclude our time today, Jonathan and Darrell, I'm going to pose this question to both of you. In our last moments together, what would you say to ministry leaders today about the topic of virtual and digital churches? Maybe they're a little nervous, maybe not sure what to do. What could you tell our listeners today as we summarize?
I think what I would say is that one of the things that the virtual media allows for, it's a couple of benefits. One is it allows an opportunity to experience the global church in a way that otherwise might be more challenging. It's the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that I would say is the virtual church is an extension of something you've actually been dealing with as a local pastor ever since there was church on radio, which is other voices speaking into the teaching and preaching that you do at your local congregation. Now, you can view that as a good thing or a bad thing. The thing you need to do is to be faithful in how you present the word and try and help people develop the ability to discern what they may pick up online or over radio or over television or anywhere else. But if you view that strictly as competition, I don't think you're going to help yourself in thinking through what the church is when we think of church in the universal sense as opposed to in relationship to a local body, because people are connected to the church at both levels.
When we first wrote the book was published in March of 2021. At that time, it was still a question in my mind whether virtual reality would take off and whether the technology would become mainstream at any point in the future. And in the intervening 3 years, it seems clear to me that some variety of that technology is certainly going to succeed in our culture. We may call it something else by the time it arrives to a place of cultural dominance, but I think to those in ministry, it's the wrong question. Should we or should we not do church in virtual reality? I don't think that's a helpful question. I think the question is, how do we pastor those who are bombarded by constant virtual telecommunications? I mean, people's lives are just getting completely drawn into virtual telecommunication. We do it now for many hours a day, every day. That's going to continue, and that's going to continue to become a mainstream. So what do we do as Christian leaders? The first thing I would say is take a really deep dive to be reflective, reflect on our own habits of using technology. Myself as a spiritual leader, how am I using technology? Am I using technology in a way that promotes God's redemptive processes in me, or am I wasting my time? Am I, allowing the distraction that is so possible through online technology? Am I allowing that distraction to tear away at my soul? Fasting from technology is a great thing to do. We Christian leaders ought to do that all regularly. And then the last thing that I would say is I still think, and this conviction comes out in the book briefly, but I still think that online prayer or virtual prayer is one of the killer apps, if you will, of the technology. And just like the Reformation was a Christian movement or an expression of Christianity that was really, really driven by exegesis and close Bible reading, I think what's happening next in the church is a church that's driven by prayer. So I would say learn firsthand what it means to walk with an online community in prayer, and give at least, say, an hour a week or so to exercise yourself in online prayer. I don't think you'll ever regret it.
Jonathan and Darrell, what an absolute pleasure it has been today. I've enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to future conversations. Dr. LaJoya, any last comments?
No, I just want to say thank you. And what I'm hearing overall, I'm not hearing from either of you. This is an either or. And you've thoughtfully considered the options here. And I appreciate, in fact, even in your book, you say even churches that intend to maximize the use of VR for ministry purposes should still retain mechanisms to facilitate in-person communication and interaction. So I see a balance there, right? And the whole idea of building trust, et cetera, et cetera. So really a good conversation. Thanks to both of you.
You're very welcome.
If our listeners would like more,
Thanks so much for having us.
Sure.
if our listeners would like more information on virtual reality church or any of these topics, or maybe get a hold of you or even get the book, how can they get more information, gentlemen?
Darrell, you first.
Well, the book's just generally available, published by Moody Publishers, and you can get it probably ordering it through any Christian bookstore or Amazon.com. Amazon's always the fallback option in terms of getting access. And then for the stuff that we do at the seminary, it's voice.dts.edu/table podcast, which is a podcast that we host where we talk about issues of God and culture and show the relevance of theology to everyday life. That's what we're about. And we cover an array of topics, including this. In fact, Jonathan and I have done a few podcasts on this topic as well there.
Once again, Darrell, go ahead, Jonathan.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I'd love to get in contact with you. You can do that through the website, aqueductproject.org. We have a contact tab and would love to get in contact with anybody who's interested.
Darrell, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your diligence in looking in this area of ministry. Much appreciated.
Very welcome.
Wonderful day.
Blessings, brothers.
Great.
This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders in Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining. Hope you listen next time. God bless.
This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders in Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining us today.